This is Gagan Girotra, IIT Roorkee class of 2000, and I am Calcutta class of 2005. In this People Plus video, we are going to look at certain exercise questions on percentage. Let's look at this first question. It says, if the price of fuel increases by 40%, then by what percentage should you reduce your consumption to keep the overall fuel expenses as constant? Now, you would notice that first thing about this question is that there are no actual numbers, right? All it says is it gives you a percentage, right? And it expects an answer also in percentage, right? That's the first thing you notice about this question. The second thing about questions like these is that if there is a unit price, right? Unit price multiplied by the volume of consumption equals the total expense, right? And in this case, the way it works out is that if, let's say, my fuel costs rupees 100 per unit volume, right? And if I purchase 100 units of volume, right, then the total expense that I'm going to incur on purchasing 100 units at a price of 100 rupees per unit is going to be 100 times 100, which is equal to 10,000. Okay. Now, why did I take 100 and 100 here? Because very simply, this question deals with percentages and it does not give you actual numbers, right? So if a question is not dealing with actual numbers, then it becomes very convenient for us to assume whatever is not given as percentage, as 100. Okay. So let's assume that the usual situation is that the unit price of the fuel, right, and let's call it rupees per liter, right, is 100. Okay, and the volume again I calculate in liters. So at 100 rupees per liter unit price, I purchase 100 liters, and the total expense that I have is 10,000. 100 times 100, right? Now what has happened is that there is a new situation now where the price of the fuel has gone up by 40%, right? So if 100 increased by 40%, it becomes 140, right? So the new price per unit of fuel is 140, and I must keep what constant? I must keep my overall fuel expenses constant, which means that this must remain same as the previous time, right? So if this must remain same as previous time, and if this entity has gone up from 100 to 140, then what should be this entity? This entity should clearly be, because the product of these two is 10,000, then this entity must be 10,000 divided by 140, right? So when I divide 10,000 by 140, I get I get the volume to be equal to the new volume to be equal to 71.43 liters, right? So if I buy 100 liters at 100 rupees per liter, I incur 10,000 rupees. If I buy 71.43 liters at 100 rupees, 140 rupees per liter, I still incur 10,000 rupees. So the new volume is this. But the question is, by what percentage should you reduce your consumption? Now you would notice that my consumption is this volume, right? So if the original base was 100 and the new consumption is 71.43, right, then I get my answer as 100 minus 71.43, and the difference is 28.57. Now incidentally, because the base is 100, my answer will be, it is already in percentage, right? So my answer is 28.57%. All right, second question. A sells pencils 25% cheaper than B, okay, and 25% more expensive than C. So the question is, how are C and B's selling price related? By what percentage is C's selling price cheaper than B's selling price? Now, while this may sound, in the first look, it sounds very simple. In reality, it is a little bit more cryptic than how it appears at the first look. Now let's decode this sentence. Now A sells pencils 25% cheaper than the price at which B sells them. So if the selling price of A is A, right, and selling price of B is B, and the selling price of C is C, then A selling pencils 25% cheaper than B means that the selling price of A is 75% of the selling price of B. Right? Why is that? Because if this tells me that B is going to be my base, right? And anything which is 25% cheaper than B, right, is 75% of B. So A is 75% of B. Similarly, A is 25% more expensive than C, right? So that means A again, when I express it in terms of C, is 125% of C, right? Now what I need to do is I need to put C and B together, right? So I'll eliminate A and I need to equate this with this. So I get 75% of B equals 125% of C. Now what I can do is I can cancel out the percentage signs and I can cancel out this 25 times 3 and 25 times 5. So basically 3B equals 5C, right? So this is the relationship I get between B and C. But how do I need to express this is told to me by this sentence. By what percentage is C's selling price cheaper than B's selling price, right? So this time I'm going to keep B as my base, right? So I'm going to keep 5C. I'm going to express C as a certain percentage of B, right? So if 5C from here equals 3B, then C equals 3 by 5B, right? And if I have to express this in percentage, I'll multiply this by 100%. So this is 5 times 20 and C equals 3 times 20, 60% of B, right? Now does this give my answer? Yes, it does, because I need to find because if C is 60% of B, then C is 40% cheaper than B, right? So this becomes my answer. Okay. My elder brother's rope is 15% longer than the rope I have. Okay. Now it is given that my brother's rope is 2.4 meters in length. The question is, what is the length of my rope? Okay. So let's say I assume the length of my rope is X, right? So this is mine, right? And the brother's rope, if mine is X and my brother's rope is 15% longer than mine, then my brother's rope is 115% of X, right? And it is given that my brother's rope's actual length is 2.4 meters. So I equate this to 2.4 meters, right? So now it becomes a straightaway calculation. X is 2.4 meters divided by 115%, and I can replace this percentage symbol by 1 upon 100, right? So I get X equals 240 divided by 115, which is equal to approximately 2.087, or which is equal to 2.09 meters, right? So my rope is 2.09 meters and 15% longer will become 2.40 meters, which is the length of my brother's rope. This question says A's height is 30% more than B's height. So by what percentage is B's height less than A's? Yeah. So let's say A's height is A and B's height is B, right? So this sentence tells me that the relationship between A's height and B's height is that A is 30% taller than B, which means A is 130% of B, right? That's how A is. If A is 130% of B, then I can say that A is 30% taller than B, right? So now we must express B as a certain percentage of A, right? Because that's what has been asked. So B equals 1 upon 130% of A, right? So I've taken this 130% here in the denominator. Now I know that the percentage symbol equals 1 upon 100, so I get B equals 100 upon 130 times A, right? and when I simplify this, I get this equals approximately, and because I don't need to compute decimals because of the answer choices, this approximately equals 0.77 of A, right? So if B is 0.77 times A, to express this in percentage, all I need to do is multiply it by 100%, right? So B is approximately equal to 77% of A. Now if B is equal to 77% of A, then clearly B is 100 minus 77, 23% shorter than A. Let's look at this question, which says the price of grain has increased by 25%. What is the amount of grain that can now be bought with money that was previously sufficient to buy 80 kgs? Now in this question, unlike a question that we previously seen, we are given a percentage, right? And we are also given an actual quantity, right? Now you would recall that typically unit price multiplied by the volume gives me total expense, right? If this is the situation, then originally this percentage, because I'm not given the unit price, I'm only given the percentage change in unit price. Let's assume that the unit price originally was 100, right? So if originally the unit price of 100 times volume was 80 kgs, right? And I was spending 8,000 rupees on buying whatever grain I was previously buying. Now what has happened is that the price of grain has increased by 25%, right? So if originally it was 100, now it has become 125, right? So 125 is the unit price. I don't know how much I need to, how much I can buy, but the amount of money still remains 8,000. If you read this, it says, what is the amount of grain that can now be bought with the money that was sufficient to buy 80 kgs? Now previously, based on my assumption, 8,000 rupees was sufficient to buy 80 kgs. So I'll still keep this money at 8,000 rupees, right? So all I need to do is find out X from this equation. So the X value of X is 8,000 divided by 125, which is equal to 64 kgs. Okay, so now original price 100 rupees per unit. I used to buy 80 kgs for this amount. Now new price 125, I'm only able to buy 64 kgs for the same amount, right? So that's my answer. Okay, so let's look at this question. It says that in an election there were two candidates. The winner got 72% of the votes cast, right? And he wins by 880 votes. There were a total of 80% votes cast, right? So 20% voters did not vote at all, and there were no invalid votes. So the question is, what was the total number of voters? So if we start with total number of voters as X, right? Clearly there were certain voters who cast their vote and certain voters who did not cast, right? So out of these, 20% of X did not cast and 80% of X they casted their votes, right? So the people who casted their votes are 80% of X. Now this is further split, right? So since there are no invalid votes, this quantity 80% of X, it gets further split between the winner and the loser, right? Now the winner, please notice that this is not 72% of the total votes cast, okay? Because if he had got 72% of the total votes cast, then the loser would have gotten just 8% of X, right? This guy would have gotten 72% of X and this guy would have gotten 8% of X. But now it says that the winning candidate has got 72% of the votes cast only, and the number of votes cast is 80% of X. So the winner gets 72% of votes cast, which is 80% of X, right? Now if this guy's got 72% of this quantity, this boxed quantity, then this guy would have to have 100 minus 72, 28% of the same boxed quantity, right? Because that's how I split my 80% of X. I split my 80% of X between 72% of 80% of X and 28% of 80% of X. And this difference, right? This is the winning margin. This difference is 880. Right? So if I were to simplify this, I am able to take this common, 80% of X as common. So I get 80% of X I take common from both of these, and I get 72% minus 28%. 72% minus 28% is 44%. Right? So this is equal to 880. Now if we simplify this, we get X equals 880 divided by 80% and divided by 44%. Right? So if you simplify, I can take these percentage signs here, remove this percentage sign and multiply by 100, remove this percentage sign, multiply by 100, cancel out this 44 and this becomes 2, right? So I have 220,000 divided by 80. I can cancel out another 0 here and I am left with 8 to the 16. Sorry, I think I'm missing out on another 0. Yes. So this is going to be 2,500, right? So I started with 2,500 voters as X. Out of these, only 80%, which is 2,000 people cast their vote and 500 did not cast their vote at all. Out of these 2,000, 72% of 2,000 they voted for the winner and 28% of these 2,000 voted for the loser. Okay, question number 7th. So in this question it says that in a class 20% of students were absent for a test whose maximum was 100 and passing marks were 40. Okay, so there's a test, you need 40 to pass, maximum marks you can get is 100. Now out of the entire class, only 20% of the students they were absentees and the remaining 80% took the exam. The absentees were awarded 0 marks in the test. Now 30% of the class, now notice that this is not 30% of the students who took the test, this is just simply 30% of the class. They failed by 13 marks, that is they got 40 minus 13, 27, right? Another 10% of the class, again 10% of the total class, they passed by only because they got 3 grace marks. So their marks were, they had received 37 marks but they were given 3 grace marks, so they ultimately were bumped up to 40 marks each, right? And the remaining students, they scored an average of 50 marks. Okay, so let's look at this breakup. So 20% of the class has scored a 0 because they were absent. Another 30% of the class has failed by 13 marks, so they have scored 40 minus 13, 27 marks each, right? Then another 10%, they, while they did score 37, they were given grace marks, so now their totals are 40, so they scored 40 marks each, right? The remaining, now what is left, this is out of 100%, this is 60%, so the remaining 40% they have averaged 50 marks, right? So we have to find the average score of the entire class. Now to find the average score, we must find the total scores, right, and divided by the total number of students. Now in this case, because there are only percentages given, I can assume that 20%, the class can be of 100 students, 20 students got 0, 30 got 27, 10 got 40 and 40 got 50. So the average is going to be 20 students got no marks, 30 students got 27 marks each, 10 students got 40 marks each, 40 students got 50 marks each, and the total number of students is 100. So we get 0, this is 27, 3, the 81, 810, then 400, then 2000, all of this divided by 100, right? So this adds up to 3210 by 100 or 32.1, right? So that becomes my average score for the entire class. Now there could have been a question where they could have asked you for the average score of all the students who were present, right? So in that case, this part would not have been there, but anyway, they all score a 0 and this denominator would have been 80. That's all the changes in the computation that would have been required. Question number 8. So it says A spends 25% of his monthly salary on household items, right? Then he spends 10% of the balance. Yeah, okay. So this is not 10% of the total salary. It is 10% of what is left after making this expense on travel. Okay. Then of again, this time after the second deduction, whatever balance is left, he spends 20% of that on books. And after making all of these three expenses, he's left with this amount. So we have to compute the original, the starting salary. Okay. So let's start with the starting salary. Let's call it S. Now 25% of S goes to household expenses. Now if I'm starting with S, I could write S as 100% of S also, right? So this is where I start. Out of this I deduct 25% of S on household, right? So if this is what I've deducted, I'm left with only 75% of the original salary, right? Now this is what is balance left to me after taking out the household expenses, right? So now the question says he spends 10% of the balance, right? So 10% of balance now is 10% of 75% of S, right? Which is 10% is 0.1. I multiply 0.1 by 75%, so I get 7.5% of S, right? So the money spent on travel is 10% of the balance or 7.5% of the total, right? This is spent on travel. So once I subtract 7.5% from 75%, I'm left with 67.5% of the total salary, right? So this is the second balance after making these two expenses, the household and the travel, right? Now, why do I need this balance? Because he's spending another 20% of what is now left on buying books, right? So 20% of 67.5% of S is 1/5 of 67.5% of S, which is 5, 1 the 5, 17, 5, 3 the 15, 25, 5, 5 the 25, right? So 20% of 67.5% is 13.5% of S, right? So this is what I subtract, 13.5% of S on books, right? After that I'm left with 54%, right? So this 54% of S now is given to me as 12150. I need to compute S, which now becomes straightforward. This is 12150 divided by 54%, which when I compute works out to 22,500 rupees. Okay. Okay, so now again another question where the relationship between two or three entities is expressed in percentages. So let's say A's pocket money is A, B's pocket money is B, and C's pocket money is C. So it is given that A's pocket money is 30% more than B's. So what A gets is 130% of B, right? Similarly, A's pocket money is 30% less than C's pocket money. So what A gets is 70% of what C gets, right? Now combined pocket money is 1455. That means A plus B plus C is given to us as 1455, and we must compute A, right? So we'll retain this variable A and write this as A. Now B is A upon 130%, right? And C is A upon 70%, right? So this now we must solve. So this is 1.3 or 10 by 13. This is 70 by 100 or basically 10a by 7, right? So let's write this as a 10 by 13a, sorry, 10 by 7a. So 13 7 the 91. I take this as LCM, so I get 91a. This is 13 7 the 7 10 the 70a, 7 13 the 13 10 the 130a equals 145. Sorry, this should be 1455. Sorry, this should be 1455. Sorry about that. 1455. Just let me write it more neatly. Okay, so let's see what this adds up to. This is 70 plus 130, 200, 291a divided by 91 equals 1455. So a equals 1455 times 91 divided by 291. When you cancel out these things, you get 455, right? So the answer is that A's pocket money is 455. The producers decided to reduce the ticket price of their play by 20%. This resulted in a jump in overall collections by 20%. Question is, what was the increase in attendance due to price reduction? Now, again, this is a question similar to what we've previously done. So the unit price, which is the ticket price multiplied by attendance or the number of people, it gives us total collections, right? So if let's say I start with, again, so there's no numbers, there's only percentages. If originally, right, if originally my ticket was priced at rupees 100 and there were only 100 people attending the show, I was collecting a total of 10,000 rupees. Now what has happened is that I've reduced the ticket price by 20%, right? So if I reduce 100 by 20%, I'm left with 80 rupees per ticket, right? Now the increase in overall collections that has happened is 20%. Now this collection, this 10,000 has increased by 20%, right? So basically 120% of 10,000 is 12,000 rupees, right? So that's from 10,000 to 12,000 is a 20% increase, right? So I need to compute the number of people who attended the show. This is clearly 12,000 divided by 80, right? So that's the number of people who have attended the show. So when I cancel these out, I get 8 1 the 8, 48 5 the 40. So 150 people have now attended the show. So from an original 100, if the attendance goes up to 150, then the increment is 50 on a base of 100, which is equal to 50%, right? So the attendance has gone up by 50%. It has offset the ticket price reduction, and the overall collections are now higher by 20%. So my answer is going to be 50%. Thanks for watching the video. You can give your feedback in the comments section below. Please click the like button if you thought the video was helpful. For lesson updates, you may subscribe to my YouTube channel People Plus, or you may read my blogs at peopleprep.com, or you can directly connect to us through our Facebook page @PeoplePlus, or you can email to me at gagan@peopleplus.com. Thank you.